Malicious Compliance grandparents wrote me out of will, so I exposed their dirty secret. I stared at the legal document in my trembling hands, reading the same line over and over until the words burned into my retinas. To our grandson, my name, we leave nothing, as he has chosen a path that goes against our Christian values and the sanctity of marriage. Nothing. After 28 years of family dinners, holiday visits, and being their precious boy, I was worth exactly nothing to them. Meanwhile, my cousin Derek, who'd been arrested twice for DUI and cheated on every girlfriend he'd ever had, was inheriting their entire $2.3 million estate for being morally upright and following God's plan for marriage. All because I wouldn't break up with Marcus. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. I'm sorry, but those were your grandmother's exact instructions. She was very specific about her reasoning. I folded the will carefully and slid it into my backpack, right next to my laptop where I'd been desperately trying to figure out how to pay for my final semester of graduate school. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was drowning in student debt while sitting in a mahogany-paneled office discussing millions of dollars that used to have my name on them. Thank you, I managed to say, though I'm not sure what I was thanking him for. For destroying my financial future. For confirming that my grandparents' love came with conditions I'd never be able to meet. I walked out into the crisp October air, my phone already buzzing with a text from Marcus. How did it go? How did it go? My devoutly Christian grandparents, pillars of St. Augustine Methodist Church, had officially disowned me for loving the wrong person. They'd rather give everything to Derek, who couldn't hold down a job but happened to be engaged to a woman, than acknowledge that their gay grandson might deserve a single penny of the family money. But here's the thing about being written off by hypocrites, it has a way of clarifying your priorities real fast. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the law office building, letting the anger build. Not just anger at being broke, or even at losing my inheritance. I was furious at their sanctimonious bullshit, their holier-than-thou attitude that had poisoned every family gathering for the past 3 years since I'd come out. They wanted to play moral superiority. They wanted to lecture me about Christian values and proper behavior. That's when I started laughing. Actually laughing, right there in the parking lot, because suddenly I remembered what I'd been keeping secret for them all these years. What I'd stumbled across during countless Sunday dinners in their pristine suburban home. What I'd been too respectful, too naive, to ever mention to anyone. My saintly grandparents, the ones who tithed 10% of their income and never missed a church service, the ones who just disowned me for my immoral lifestyle, they'd been running an illegal gambling operation out of their basement for over 15 years. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos, finding the ones I'd taken last Christmas when I'd gone downstairs to grab more folding chairs. The betting sheets, the cash counting tables, the whiteboard with odds written in Grandpa's careful handwriting. I thought it was funny back then, this harmless little secret. Their adorable rebellion against their own stuffiness. Not so harmless anymore. I started the car, my hands steady now, my mind crystal clear. They taught me an important lesson today about family loyalty and Christian love. Time to return the favor. The drive home gave me time to think, and by the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I had a plan forming. But first, I needed to see exactly what I was working with. Marcus was waiting on our couch, his laptop balanced on his knees, probably grading papers for the high school where he taught. He looked up when I walked in, and his face immediately shifted from hopeful to concerned. That bad? He asked, closing the laptop. Worse. I dropped onto the couch beside him and pulled out the will. They didn't just reduce it. They completely cut me out. Everything goes to Derek. Marcus read the document, his jaw tightening with each line. Jesus. They actually put that in writing? About you going against Christian values? Oh, it gets better. I grabbed my laptop and started pulling up files I'd forgotten I even had. Remember last Christmas when I was helping set up for dinner and went to get those extra chairs from the basement? Yeah. I took some pictures. I thought it was just funny at the time, Grandma and Grandpa's little secret hobby. The first photo loaded, a card table covered with betting slips, organized in neat piles by Grandma's obsessively tidy hands. Turns out they've been running a full-scale gambling operation down there. Marcus leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Holy shit. Are those church bulletins next to the betting sheets? Gets worse. I clicked through more photos. Look at this. The next image showed Grandpa's record-keeping system, a composition notebook filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts. I'd initially assumed it was some kind of household budget, but looking at it now with fresh eyes, the pattern was obvious. Every entry was a bet, carefully tracked with payouts and losses. Is that Mrs. Henderson's name? Marcus pointed at a line item showing a $200 loss. From the church choir. Half the congregation is in here, by my count. I scrolled through the photos. And look at these amounts. This isn't just casual poker night money. The numbers were staggering. Individual bets ranging from $50 to $500, with weekly totals in the thousands. My grandparents weren't just running some harmless gambling ring for their friends, this was a serious operation with serious money. Wait, Marcus grabbed my arm. Go back to that last photo. I clicked back, and we both stared at the image. In the corner of the basement, barely visible behind some storage boxes, was a safe. A big one. Professional grade. You think that's where they keep the cash? Marcus asked. Has to be. They always insisted on being cash-only people, remember? Never used credit cards, always paid bills with checks or money orders. The pieces were falling into place. This is how they accumulated so much wealth. It wasn't just Grandpa's hardware store and smart investments. They were running an illegal casino in their basement and not reporting the income. Marcus sat back, whistling low. Tax evasion on top of illegal gambling. That's federal. I stared at the photos, my mind racing. 3 years ago, when I'd first brought Marcus to a family dinner, my grandparents had been polite but cold. When I officially came out, they'd started the lectures about sin and moral decay. When Marcus and I moved in together, they'd stopped calling altogether except for obligatory holiday invitations where they'd pointedly ask about my friend while fawning over Derek's latest girlfriend. Now I was sitting here with evidence that could destroy them, while they just destroyed me. What are you thinking? Marcus asked quietly. I looked at him, this man I loved, who they decided made me unworthy of family, and felt that clarity return. I'm thinking, I said, that it's time for some truth. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to my graduate research position. I wasn't actually sick, but I needed time to properly catalog what I had before making any moves. Marcus had already left for school, kissing me goodbye with a worried look and making me promise not to do anything too nuclear without talking to him first. I spread everything out on our dining room table like I was preparing for a thesis defense. Photos printed and organized chronologically. A legal pad where I started listing names I could identify from Grandpa's betting records. My laptop opened to a folder I'd completely forgotten about, voice memos from family gatherings where I'd recorded Grandpa telling his stories, just for the memories. That's when I hit gold. Buried in a recording from Easter dinner 2 years ago, past Grandma's complaints about the church potluck committee and Derek's drunken rambling about his job prospects, I found Grandpa explaining his system to someone I couldn't identify on the recording. The beauty is in the volume, his voice crackled through my laptop speakers. Small margins, but consistent. And the clientele is built in, they all trust each other, they all have regular income, and they're all too embarrassed to cause trouble if they lose big. My hands actually shook as I listened to him describe how they'd started small, just football pools at church, then expanded to basketball, baseball, eventually taking action on everything from horse races to reality TV shows. The someone, I now realized it had to be Derek from the occasional grunt of acknowledgement, asked about getting caught. Who's gonna report us? Pastor Williams. He's in for $200 a week minimum. Mrs. Chen from the Women's Auxiliary. She runs our March Madness pools. The whole operation is bulletproof because everyone's dirty. I paused the recording and stared at my notes. This wasn't just gambling, this was a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of their church community. The same church where they'd been loudly condemning my sinful lifestyle for the past 3 years. My phone rang, snapping me out of my investigative trance. Derek's name on the caller ID made my stomach clench. Hey, cousin, his voice was trying for sympathetic but landed somewhere around smug satisfaction. Heard about the will reading yesterday. That's rough, man. Yeah, it's been a difficult time, I said carefully. Look, I want you to know I had nothing to do with their decision. I mean, I get why they did it, the Bible's pretty clear about marriage being between a man and woman, but I wouldn't have asked them to cut you out completely. The condescension in his voice made me want to scream. This from someone who totaled 2 cars drunk driving and hadn't held a steady job since high school. That's very generous of you, Derek. Actually, that's kind of why I'm calling. I could hear him shifting around, probably sitting in his car outside whatever bar he frequented during the day. I was thinking, once the estate settles, maybe I could help you out a little. You know, family and all. Maybe enough to finish school. And there it was, the power play disguised as charity. Derek wanted me to be grateful to him, wanted me to come begging for scraps of what should have been partly mine anyway. I appreciate the thought, I said, but I'm figuring things out on my own. Don't be too proud, man. Grandpa always said pride was a sin too. After I hung up, I sat staring at the evidence spread across my table. Derek had just made this personal in a way it hadn't been before. He wasn't just inheriting money, he was planning to lord it over me, to make me dependent on his guilt-motivated handouts while positioning himself as the moral superior. I picked up my phone and started researching newspaper editors in our area. Time to see how much the local community valued their moral leaders. But first, I needed more evidence. And I knew exactly where to get it. That evening, I told Marcus I was going to visit my parents to process everything. It wasn't entirely a lie, I did need to process, just not in the way he thought. What I really needed was to get back into my grandparents' house one more time before they changed the locks or Derek started nosing around his inheritance. My parents lived 3 blocks away from Grandma and Grandpa, and they'd given me a spare key years ago for emergencies. They were spending the week at my aunt's house in Florida, conveniently leaving their house empty and providing me with the perfect cover story. The plan was simple, get into the basement during their Wednesday evening church service, document everything properly this time, and maybe, if I was lucky, find more concrete evidence of the financial scope of their operation. What I didn't expect was to pull into their driveway at 7:30 p.m. and see lights on in the basement windows. Church service ran from 7 to 8:30 every Wednesday. They never missed it. Ever. I sat in my car, debating whether to leave, when I heard voices coming from the backyard. Moving closer, I realized the basement's exterior entrance was propped open, and people were actually going in and out. On a Wednesday. During church. That's when it clicked, they weren't missing church. They were running their operation during church, using the service as cover. Anyone seeing cars in the driveway would assume it was some kind of church committee meeting. I crept around to the side of the house where I could see through the basement window without being spotted. What I saw made my jaw drop. This wasn't the small-time operation I'd imagined. The basement had been completely transformed since Christmas. Professional poker tables, a full bar setup, multiple flat-screen TVs showing different sporting events, and at least 20 people I recognized from St. Augustine Methodist Church placing bets and playing cards. Mrs. Patterson from the Sunday School Committee was dealing what looked like Texas Hold'em. Mr. Rodriguez, who ran the church's financial committee, was taking money at what appeared to be a sports betting station. And there, in the middle of it all, were my grandparents, not as participants, but as operators. Grandma was working some kind of computer system, probably tracking bets, while Grandpa moved between tables collecting what I assumed was the house's cut. They were running a full-scale casino, and their customer base was the entire church congregation. I pulled out my phone and started recording through the window, but the angle was terrible and the lighting made everything look shadowy. I needed to get closer, but there were too many people around. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Derek's car was parked across the street. He was already here, already part of this. The golden child wasn't just inheriting clean money, he was being brought into the family business. Everything he'd said on the phone about not knowing why they'd cut me out was complete bullshit. He knew exactly what they were protecting. I was backing away from the window when my phone rang. The sound seemed impossibly loud in a quiet neighborhood, and I fumbled to silence it, but not before I saw several faces in the basement turn toward the window. The caller ID showed Marcus's name, but I couldn't answer. I was too busy running back to my car as quietly as possible, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I heard the basement door open and Grandpa's voice calling out, "Hello? Someone out there?" I made it to my car and drove 3 blocks before pulling over to catch my breath. My phone showed 2 missed calls from Marcus and a text, "Everything okay? You sound stressed when you called earlier." Everything was definitely not okay. What I'd stumbled onto was so much bigger than I'd imagined. This wasn't just tax evasion or illegal gambling, this was organized crime disguised as a church social group. And now they might know someone had been watching. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Hello. This is Pastor Williams from St. Augustine Methodist. I think we need to talk." My blood turned to ice water. Pastor Williams, the same pastor Grandpa had mentioned taking $200 a week minimum in bets, was calling me at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday night, 30 minutes after I'd been caught spying on their illegal casino operation. "I'm sorry, Pastor, but I think you have the wrong number," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't think I do, son. Your grandfather mentioned you might be going through a difficult time after yesterday's will reading. I was hoping we could meet and discuss some mutual concerns." The way he said mutual concerns made my skin crawl. This wasn't a pastoral care call. This was damage control. "I appreciate the thought, Pastor, but I'm not really in a place for spiritual guidance right now." "Oh, I think you might be surprised what kind of guidance I can offer." His voice had an edge now, the friendly pastor facade slipping. "Especially regarding family loyalty and the importance of keeping private family matters private." There it was, the threat, wrapped in religious language but crystal clear in meaning. They knew it was me at the window. They knew what I'd seen. And now they were closing ranks. "I'm not sure what you mean, Pastor." "Of course you don't." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Why don't you come by the church tomorrow afternoon? Say, 3 o'clock. We can discuss your future, and perhaps find ways to help with those graduate school expenses I hear you're worried about." The carrot and the stick, all in one phone call. Pay me off to keep quiet, or else. The problem was, I had no idea what "or else" looked like when it involved a pastor, my grandparents, and apparently half the church congregation running an illegal gambling operation together. "I'll have to check my schedule," I said. "I'm sure you will. Oh, and son. I'd suggest not discussing this conversation with anyone. Some topics are better kept within the church family, if you understand my meaning." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my car on a dark residential street, shaking with a combination of adrenaline and pure terror. This had escalated way beyond family drama over an inheritance. These people were organized, they were connected, and they were clearly willing to protect their operation. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing through possibilities. How deep did this go? Was the entire church leadership involved? Did they have connections with actual organized crime, or was this just a group of suburban gamblers who'd gotten in over their heads? More importantly, what could they actually do to me? Pastor Williams had implied they could help with my graduate school expenses, which meant they knew about my financial situation. What else did they know about my life? Marcus was grading papers at the kitchen table when I walked in, but he took one look at my face and set down his red pen. "Okay, what happened? And don't tell me nothing, because you look like you've seen a ghost." I sat down heavily across from him, staring at the stack of evidence I'd left spread across our dining room table that morning. It seemed almost quaint now, my neat little investigation into Grandma and Grandpa's hobby. "I think I'm in over my head," I said finally. "With the will situation?" "With everything." I pulled out my phone and showed him the call log. Pastor Williams from their church just called me. "Marcus, they know I was there tonight. They know I saw their operation." "Wait, slow down. You went to their house tonight. You said you were going to your parents." "I was. I mean, I did. But then I drove by their house, and I told him everything. The transformed basement, the church congregation gambling during Wednesday service, Derek's car across the street, getting spotted at the window." Marcus listened without interrupting, but I could see his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "So let me get this straight," he said when I finished. "Your grandparents aren't just running some small-time gambling ring. They've turned their basement into an actual casino, their customer base is their entire church congregation, the pastor is involved, and Derek is being brought into the operation as part of his inheritance. That's about the size of it. And now the pastor is trying to bribe you to keep quiet. Or threaten me. I'm not entirely sure which." Marcus rubbed his temples, a gesture I recognized as his thinking through a complex problem mode. "This is organized crime, isn't it? Like, actual organized crime. I don't know. Maybe. It's definitely way more sophisticated than I thought. I picked up one of the photos from Christmas, the one showing Grandpa's careful record keeping. But I keep coming back to something Grandpa said in that recording. He called the operation bulletproof because everyone's dirty. What do you mean? Think about it. If the entire church leadership is involved, who's going to report them? If half the congregation is placing bets, who's going to testify against them? They've created this closed loop where everyone has something to lose if the operation gets exposed." Marcus nodded slowly. "Which means you're the only clean person who knows about it." "Exactly. And that makes me either very valuable or very dangerous to them, depending on how you look at it." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over both of us. Finally, Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. "So what do you want to do?" I looked at the evidence spread across our table, thought about Derek's condescending phone call, remembered the cold words in the will about my immoral lifestyle, and felt that familiar anger building again. "I want to burn it all down," I said. "But I'm starting to think they might burn me first." The next morning, I woke up to find my car's tires slashed. All 4 of them, neat diagonal cuts that looked almost surgical in their precision. No random vandalism here, this was a message. I stood in the parking lot of our apartment complex at 7 a.m., staring at the damage while my coffee went cold in my hands. Marcus appeared beside me in his bathrobe, having followed me down when I didn't come back upstairs. Jesus Christ. When did this happen? Sometime between midnight and now. I walked around the car, documenting everything with my phone. Look at this, they didn't touch anyone else's car. Just mine. The Honda Civic next to me was untouched. The pickup truck across the row was fine. Even the expensive BMW that was usually a target for jealous vandalism sat pristine in the morning sun. Only my beat-up Toyota looked like it had met an angry knife. We need to call the police, Marcus said, but I was already shaking my head. And tell them what? That I think my grandparents' church friends slashed my tires because I saw their gambling operation. I snapped another photo of the damage. They'll think I'm paranoid or delusional. You don't know it was them. Really? 24 hours after Pastor Williams calls me with barely veiled threats, my car gets professionally vandalized. That's one hell of a coincidence. Marcus pulled his robe tighter against the morning chill. Okay, fine. Let's say it was them. What's the message here? I stared at the ruined tires, thinking about the precision of the cuts, the targeted nature of the vandalism. They're showing me they know where I live. They know what I drive. They can get to me whenever they want. That's... Marcus swallowed hard. That's actually terrifying. Yeah, it is. I pocketed my phone and headed back toward our apartment. Which means I need to move faster than I planned. We spent the morning on the phone with insurance companies and tire shops, burning through money we didn't have to fix damage caused by people who just inherited millions. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it did clarify something important. I was past the point of backing down. While we waited for the tow truck, I made a decision that would have seemed insane 48 hours ago. I called the local newspaper. City desk, this is Jennifer Martinez. Hi, I'd like to speak to someone about a potential story involving illegal gambling and tax evasion at a local church. There was a pause. Can you hold please? 3 transfers later, I was connected to someone named Tom Bradley, investigative reporter, who sounded appropriately skeptical when I started explaining the situation. So you're telling me an entire Methodist congregation is running a casino operation out of someone's basement? His tone suggested he'd heard crazier stories, but not many. That's exactly what I'm telling you. And I have documentation. What kind of documentation? Photos, audio recordings, financial records showing betting amounts in the thousands per week. I was pacing our living room now, Marcus watching me with growing concern. Names, dates, a whole network of church leadership involved in covering it up. And you're coming forward now because... Here was the tricky part. I could hardly tell a newspaper reporter that I was doing this for revenge because they'd written me out of their will. Because they threatened me to keep quiet. As of yesterday, this became about more than just illegal gambling. That got his attention. What kind of threats? I told him about Pastor Williams' call, about the carefully worded implications, about waking up to slashed tires. Bradley started asking more specific questions, names, addresses, dates, the scope of the operation. If what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just a gambling story, he said finally. This is organized crime with a religious cover story. Tax evasion on a massive scale. Corruption of religious institutions. This could be huge. How huge? Federal investigation huge. IRS involvement huge. The kind of story that wins journalism awards if we can prove it. My heart was racing now. What do you need from me? Everything you've got. But more importantly, I need you to understand what you're getting into. If these people are as organized as you say they are, and if they're already making threats, this could get dangerous for you. I looked at Marcus, who was shaking his head frantically, mouthing, no, 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 at me. I'm already in danger, I said. At least this way, maybe I can control the narrative. Bradley was quiet for a moment. Can you meet me this afternoon? Somewhere public, bring everything you have. I'll want to verify what you're showing me before we move forward. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown at 2 p.m., 3 blocks away from the church where I was supposedly meeting Pastor Williams at 3. The timing felt appropriate, one meeting to destroy everything, another to clean up the aftermath. After I hung up, Marcus sat down heavily on our couch. You realize there's no going back from this, right? Once you give that information to a reporter, this becomes public. Your family will never forgive you. My family already disowned me, I reminded him. The question is whether I'm going to let them intimidate me into silence while they keep operating their criminal enterprise. What if they do more than slash your tires next time? It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a good answer for. But as I looked at the evidence still spread across our dining room table, I realized something important. I wasn't just angry about the money anymore. I was angry about the hypocrisy, the corruption, the way they'd used moral superiority as a weapon while being criminals themselves. Then at least someone will know why, I said finally. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, looking forward to our meeting this afternoon. 3 p.m. sharp. Come alone. Pastor Williams. I showed Marcus the message, and his face went pale. He's making sure you know he has your phone number. That he can reach you whenever he wants. Good, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. That means I'm getting to them. But as I started gathering my evidence for the meeting with Tom Bradley, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something much bigger and more dangerous than I'd originally planned. The slashed tires were just the beginning. The meeting with Tom Bradley went better than I'd expected, and worse than I'd feared. Better because he took one look at my evidence and immediately started making phone calls to what sounded like federal contacts. This is exactly the kind of systematic fraud the IRS loves to prosecute, he'd said, photographing every document with professional precision. Tax evasion, unreported income, organized gambling, you've handed me a career-making story. Worse because he'd insisted on walking me to my car afterward, constantly checking over his shoulder like we were being watched. I've covered organized crime before, he'd explained. These people don't threaten witnesses unless they have something serious to protect. You need to be careful. Now I was sitting in a St. Augustine Methodist Church parking lot at 2:55 p.m., watching Pastor Williams through his office window as he paced back and forth, clearly agitated. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since I'd left the coffee shop, 3 calls from Grandma, 2 from Derek, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. I'd ignored them all. The church secretary waved me toward the pastor's office when I walked in, her smile strained in a way that suggested she knew this wasn't a normal pastoral visit. Pastor Williams looked up when I knocked, and I was struck by how different he seemed from the confident voice on the phone last night. He looked tired, stressed, maybe even scared. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm curious what kind of guidance you think I need, Pastor." He leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "You're angry about the will. I understand that. Your grandparents made a difficult decision based on their deeply held beliefs about family and morality." "Their deeply held beliefs," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling it? I think you know what I'm talking about." His voice hardened slightly. "Your grandparents are good people who've made some questionable choices in their later years. But they don't deserve to have their lives destroyed over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I couldn't keep the incredulous laugh from escaping. "Pastor, I saw your Wednesday night service. That wasn't a misunderstanding." His face went completely pale. "What exactly do you think you saw?" "I saw half your congregation gambling in my grandparents' basement while you took a cut of the action. I saw Mrs. Patterson dealing poker and Mr. Rodriguez running a sports betting operation. I saw you running a criminal enterprise disguised as a church social group." Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the desk between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you have any idea how much good this church does in the community? How many families we've helped through difficult times? How many children we've fed, how many homeless we've sheltered? With money from illegal gambling? With money from consenting adults who choose to participate in harmless recreation." His voice was getting stronger now, taking on the cadence of a practiced sermon. "Money that goes right back into helping people who need it most." I stared at him, genuinely shocked by the rationalization. "You're seriously trying to tell me this is charity work?" "I'm telling you that sometimes good people have to make complicated choices to serve a higher purpose. Your grandparents understand that. Your cousin Derek understands that. The question is whether you're mature enough to understand it too." There it was, the same condescending tone Derek had used on the phone, the same implication that I was too naive or stubborn to see the bigger picture. As if running an illegal casino was some kind of sophisticated moral philosophy I wasn't smart enough to grasp. "And if I'm not mature enough?" I asked. Pastor Williams opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across to me. "Then perhaps this will help clarify things." Inside were photographs. Pictures of me and Marcus at various locations around town, coming out of restaurants, walking through the park, kissing goodbye outside Marcus's school. Someone had been following us, documenting our relationship, building what looked like a surveillance file. My hands were shaking as I flipped through them. "What the hell is this?" "Insurance," Pastor Williams said calmly. "Marcus teaches at a very conservative school district, doesn't he? I imagine his colleagues and students' parents would find these photos quite interesting. Especially if they were accompanied by information about his lifestyle choices." The threat hit me like a physical blow. Marcus could lose his job. In our conservative area, being outed at work could destroy his career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for. "You're blackmailing me." "I'm offering you perspective. Your grandparents' private recreational activities harm no one. But public exposure could harm many people, including someone you care about very much." I stared at the photos, my mind racing. They'd been watching us, following us, building leverage they could use to destroy Marcus if I didn't cooperate. This wasn't just about protecting their gambling operation anymore, this was about controlling me completely. "How long have you been having us followed?" "Long enough to understand what matters to you." Pastor Williams leaned forward. "But it doesn't have to matter to anyone else. Keep your grandparents' private business private, and these photos stay private too. Everyone wins." I slid the photos back into the envelope, my hands steady now despite the rage building in my chest. "And if I agree to keep quiet? Then perhaps we can find ways to help with those graduate school expenses. Perhaps Marcus might even find opportunities for advancement in his career. Good things happen to people who understand the value of discretion. The carrot and stick, just like he promised. Play along with their criminal enterprise, and they'd take care of us financially. Cause trouble, and they'd destroy the man I loved." I stood up, tucking the envelope under my arm. "I need time to think about this." "Of course. But don't take too long. Some opportunities have expiration dates." As I walked out of the church, my phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bradley. "Great meeting today. Story runs tomorrow morning, front page. Hope you're ready for this." I looked back at the church building, thinking about Pastor Williams' threats, the photos of Marcus, the choice they thought they'd given me between protecting my partner and exposing their crimes. They'd made one critical mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed I hadn't already made my choice. The story was already out there, but Pastor Williams didn't know that yet. Which meant I had maybe 12 hours before their whole world imploded, 12 hours where they still thought they held all the cards. I sat in my car outside the church, staring at the envelope full of surveillance photos, when my phone rang. Derek again. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Now. I'm kind of busy processing some recent revelations about our family's moral standards." "Cut the bullshit. I know you met with that reporter today." My blood went cold. "What reporter?" "Tom Bradley from the newspaper. You were seen at Grind Coffee on 5th Street, showing him a bunch of documents." Derek's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "What the hell did you tell him?" "They'd been watching me at the coffee shop. While I'd been congratulating myself on moving against them, they'd been tracking my every move, monitoring my meetings, staying one step ahead. I told him the truth about what our family really does for money." "You stupid son of a bitch." Derek's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just about Grandma and Grandpa. There are other people involved. Important people. Important people like Pastor Williams. Like half the church congregation. Bigger than that." There was real fear in his voice now. "Meet me at Riverside Park in 20 minutes. The pavilion by the duck pond. Come alone, and bring whatever copies you made of those documents." And if I don't? Then those photos Pastor Williams showed you today are going to be the least of your problems. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in the church parking lot. Bigger than the church congregation. What did that mean? How deep did this operation actually go? I drove to Riverside Park with my mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Derek was already there when I arrived, pacing beside the picnic tables like a caged animal. He looked terrible, unshaven, exhausted, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like terror. You need to call that reporter back, he said the moment I got out of my car. Tell him you made a mistake, that you were lying, whatever it takes to kill the story. Why would I do that? Because you don't understand who you're fucking with. Derek grabbed my arm, his grip desperate. This isn't just some small-time church gambling ring. The operation here feeds into something much bigger. Regional networks. People who don't appreciate attention from journalists. I pulled away from him. What kind of people? The kind who make Pastor Williams look like a Sunday school teacher. Derek ran his hands through his hair. Look, I never wanted to be part of this, okay? But when Grandpa started bringing me in, showing me the books, I realized we're not just talking about church ladies betting on football games. Then what are we talking about? Derek looked around the empty park, as if checking for surveillance, then pulled out his phone and showed me a text conversation. The messages were mostly numbers and abbreviations I didn't understand, but one thing was clear, the amounts being discussed were massive. Tens of thousands of dollars moving in single transactions. We're a front, he said quietly. The church thing, Grandma and Grandpa's basement operation, it's all a front for washing money from bigger operations. Sports betting, online gambling, stuff I don't even want to know about. The pieces started clicking into place. The professional-grade safe I'd seen in the basement. The sophisticated record-keeping system. The cash-only lifestyle that had allowed my grandparents to accumulate millions without obvious income sources. Money laundering, I said. Among other things. Derek's phone buzzed, and his face went even paler as he read the message. Shit. They know about the reporter meeting. They want to meet with you. Who's they? Trust me, you don't want to know. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip almost painful. Please, just call Bradley back. Tell him you were mistaken about what you saw. Make this go away before it gets worse. I looked at my cousin, this person who'd been handed everything while I'd been discarded, and realized he wasn't the golden child living a charmed life. He was trapped in the same web of corruption and fear as everyone else, maybe more trapped than anyone because he was being groomed as the next generation. I can't, I said. The story's already written. It runs tomorrow morning. Derek staggered backward like I'd hit him. No. No, no, no. You don't understand. When these people find out. His phone rang, cutting him off mid-sentence. He looked at the caller ID and his face went white as paper. I have to take this, he whispered, then answered with a voice that shook despite his obvious effort to control it. Yes, sir. He's here with me now. I could hear a man's voice on the other end, calm and measured, but I couldn't make out the words. Derek's responses were mostly, yes, sir, and I understand, sir, while his eyes stayed locked on mine with an expression that looked like an apology. They want to meet with you, he said after hanging up. Tonight. 7 o'clock. Who does? The people who decide whether this stays a local news story or becomes a much bigger problem. Derek's voice was barely above a whisper. And they're not nearly as reasonable as Pastor Williams. I stared at Derek, trying to process what he was telling me. What exactly happens at 7 o'clock? I don't know. They don't tell me details. His hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. But I've seen what happens to people who cause problems for their operation. Remember Jimmy Castellano from high school? I did remember Jimmy. He disappeared 2 years ago, supposedly moved to Florida for work, though no one had heard from him since. What about him? He was skimming from their online betting network. They found out. Derek took a long drag, his eyes distant. He didn't move to Florida. The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about money laundering or illegal gambling anymore. These people were apparently willing to make problems permanently disappear. Derek, we need to call the police. Right now. With what? Everything I just told you is hearsay. And half the police department probably places bets through the network anyway. He flicked ash onto the ground. Besides, calling the cops would be the last mistake either of us ever made. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, staying late for parent conferences. Home around 8. Love you. 8 o'clock. An hour after whatever was supposed to happen at 7. I felt sick thinking about Marcus walking into our empty apartment, finding whatever message these people might leave behind. I have to warn Marcus, I said, pulling out my phone. Derek's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. No calls. They're probably monitoring everything now. He glanced around the park again, paranoid. Look, maybe if you just meet with them, explain that you were upset about the will and acted impulsively, maybe they'll find a way to handle this quietly. Handle it how? I don't know. Discredit you somehow, make it look like you're lying, pay off the reporter, these people have resources you can't imagine. I jerked my hand away from him. So I'm supposed to walk into some meeting with criminals and hope they don't decide I'm too much of a liability to live. You're supposed to fix the mess you created before it gets us all killed. Derek's voice echoed across the empty park, and he immediately looked around nervously, as if volume alone might have attracted unwanted attention. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. There's something else. The reason they're taking this so seriously. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through messages. The church operation isn't just local. There are 12 other community organizations running similar setups across 3 states. Churches, community centers, even a few synagogues. If one location gets exposed, the whole network gets investigated. Millions of dollars in operations. Hundreds of people involved. Some of them in positions where exposure would mean more than just criminal charges. He showed me another text thread, this one with what looked like political names I vaguely recognized. This goes all the way to state legislature, maybe higher. I sat down heavily on one of the picnic tables, the scope of what I'd stumbled into finally becoming clear. This wasn't just my hypocritical grandparents running a basement casino. This was a massive criminal enterprise using religious institutions as fronts, with connections reaching into government and law enforcement. And tomorrow morning, Tom Bradley's story was going to detonate like a bomb in the middle of all of it. The 7 o'clock meeting, I said. Where is it? They'll text me the location an hour beforehand. It's always different, always somewhere public enough that nothing obvious can happen, but private enough that conversations don't get overheard. And if I don't show up? Derek's cigarette burned down to his fingers, but he didn't seem to notice. Then they'll assume you're not interested in reasonable solutions. And these people have very unreasonable backup plans. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Tom Bradley. Quick question about tomorrow's story. Can you verify the spelling of Pastor Williams' first name? Want to make sure we get everything exactly right. The story was real. It was happening. In less than 12 hours, the newspaper would hit stands with everything I'd given them, and there would be no taking it back. I looked at Derek, who was reading the text over my shoulder, his face cycling through expressions of panic, rage, and what looked like resignation. You really did it, he whispered. You really burned it all down. Yeah, I said, standing up and heading back to my car. I really did. Where are you going? To find somewhere safe for Marcus to spend the night. Then I guess I'm going to that 7 o'clock meeting. What are you going to tell them? I turned back to look at my cousin, this person who'd been chosen over me, who'd inherited millions while I'd been discarded, who was now more terrified than I'd ever seen another human being. The truth, I said. That it's too late to stop what's coming. The 7 o'clock meeting location came via text at 6 p.m. sharp, parking garage behind First National Bank. Level 3, northeast corner. Come alone. I stared at the message while sitting in Marcus's classroom, having convinced him to pack a bag and stay at his sister's house without explaining why. He'd fought me on it until I showed him the surveillance photos, watching his face go pale as he realized how long we'd been watched. This is insane, he'd whispered, flipping through images of us grocery shopping, walking our neighbor's dog, sitting on our own couch visible through our living room window. How long have they been doing this? Long enough to know your schedule, where you work, where you live. I'd helped him throw clothes into an overnight bag. Please, just trust me. Stay at Sarah's tonight, don't come home until I call you. Now I was sitting in an empty high school classroom at 5:45 p.m., watching Derek pace in front of the whiteboard like he was preparing to solve an equation that would save both our lives. He'd insisted on coming with me, though I suspected his motives had more to do with self-preservation than family loyalty. Okay, here's what we know about these people, he said, his voice taking on the manic energy of someone trying to think their way out of a nightmare. They prefer psychological pressure to physical violence. Bad for business if people start disappearing obviously. So they'll probably try to convince you first. Convince me of what? The story's already written. That you need to call Tom Bradley and recant everything. Say you were lying, that you fabricated evidence, that you're having some kind of mental breakdown over the will. Derek stopped pacing and looked at me directly. They might even offer to make the inheritance thing go away. Give you some money to make this worth your while. I thought about that morning's slash tires, about Pastor Williams' carefully organized surveillance photos, about Jimmy Castellano who'd apparently never made it to Florida. And if I refuse? Then they moved to plan B. Which is? Derek's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with the reflexive fear that had become his default expression. I don't know. They don't share operational details with the junior partners. At 6:30, we drove separately to the First National Bank building downtown. The parking garage was one of those concrete monuments to urban planning, all gray shadows and echoing footsteps. Level 3 was nearly empty at this time of evening, just a few scattered cars belonging to people working late. The northeast corner was darker than the rest of the level, hidden from the main traffic flow by a concrete support pillar. As we walked toward it, I could see two figures waiting beside a black sedan with tinted windows. Even from a distance, they radiated the kind of calm authority that made my survival instinct start screaming. Remember, Derek whispered as we got closer, be respectful, don't volunteer information they don't ask for, and for God's sake, don't get clever with them. The two men were study in contrasts. One was younger, maybe 40, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The other was older, gray-haired, dressed more casually but carrying himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd been making difficult decisions for a very long time. Derek, the older man nodded. Thank you for bringing your cousin. I'm Frank Carucci. This is my associate, Mr. Chen. Carucci's handshake was firm but not aggressive, his voice carrying a slight New York accent that suggested this operation had roots beyond our small southern town. Chen remained silent, but his eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the garage for potential problems. I understand you've had some concerns about your family's business arrangements, Carucci continued, as if we were discussing a minor customer service issue. Derek tells me you might be open to finding a reasonable resolution. Depends what you consider reasonable. Direct. I like that. Carucci smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Here's our situation. Tomorrow morning, a newspaper is planning to publish a story that could damage a lot of good people. People who've worked very hard to build something beneficial for their communities. Beneficial? Entertainment services, Derek tells me you call it gambling, but we prefer to think of it as recreational gaming with community reinvestment. Carucci gestured broadly, as if encompassing the entire city. The profits from these activities fund homeless shelters, food banks, scholarship programs. Your grandparents alone have contributed over $200,000 to local charities in the past 5 years. It was a smoother version of Pastor Williams' rationalization, delivered with the kind of practiced sincerity that suggested Carucci had given this speech before. The charitable giving might even be true, though I doubted it was the primary motivation for their operation. That's very altruistic, I said. But it doesn't change the fact that it's illegal. Legal, illegal, these are often matters of perspective and jurisdiction. Chen spoke for the first time, his voice carrying no trace of accent despite his name. What matters is harm versus benefit. Our activities harm no one and benefit many. Your story, however, would harm many while benefiting no one. Except for the truth. Truth is a luxury, Karuchi said, his tone hardening slightly. People like your boyfriend Marcus can't afford luxuries. People like Derek here can't afford them either. The question is whether you can afford to be the person who takes those luxuries away from them. There it was, the threat wrapped in reasonable language, the implication that my pursuit of truth would destroy everyone I cared about. They weren't just threatening me anymore, they were threatening Marcus, Derek, probably my parents and anyone else in my orbit. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bradley. Final draft is at the printer. Great work exposing this. You should be proud. Karuchi's eyes flicked to my phone, and his smile returned. Last chance for reasonable solutions, he said quietly. And if I'm not feeling reasonable? Then we'll have to explore unreasonable ones. I stared at Karuchi's calm smile, feeling the weight of his threat settle over the empty parking garage like a physical presence. Behind him, Chen had shifted slightly, his hand moving to rest inside his jacket in a gesture that was probably meant to look casual. Here's what I don't understand, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. If your operation is so bulletproof, if everyone involved is so invested in keeping quiet, why are you so worried about one newspaper story? Karuchi exchanged a glance with Chen, and for the first time since we'd started talking, he looked genuinely annoyed. Because newspaper stories have a way of attracting federal attention. And federal investigators have a way of finding things that local authorities prefer to overlook. Things like what? Like the fact that our community gaming operations represent only about 30% of our total business interests. Chen's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing quarterly earnings. The other 70% involves activities that are less socially beneficial. Derek made a small choking sound beside me, and I realized he was learning about this for the first time too. Whatever he'd thought he was inheriting from my grandparents, it was apparently much bigger and much darker than he'd understood. Drug distribution, Chen continued conversationally. Human trafficking. Corporate money laundering for clients who prefer not to use traditional banking services. The kind of business relationships that generate significant federal prison sentences. My mouth went dry. This wasn't just about illegal gambling anymore. My grandparents weren't just hypocritical churchgoers running a basement casino, they were money laundering fronts for a criminal organization that trafficked drugs and people. The beauty of using religious institutions as fronts, Karuchi explained, is that they generate automatic community trust and legal protections. Very difficult for law enforcement to obtain warrants for church property. Very easy to explain large cash donations and community events. But if a newspaper story brings scrutiny to one location, Chen added, investigators start looking at patterns across multiple locations. Suddenly our 12-state network becomes visible to people with federal badges and search warrants. I felt sick thinking about all those Sunday dinners at my grandparents' house, all those church potlucks and charity drives, knowing that the money funding everything came from human misery. How many people had been trafficked, how many lives destroyed, to pay for Grandma's pristine kitchen and Grandpa's generous donations to the church building fund. So what happens now? I asked. Karuchi pulled out his phone and showed me a text message. Bradley, Thomas, 1247, Oak Street, apartment 3B. Lives alone. Works late most nights. They had Tom Bradley's home address. They knew his schedule, probably his routines, everything they'd need to make him disappear if the story became a problem. Mr. Bradley is going to receive a very compelling reason to reconsider tomorrow's publication, Karuchi said, pocketing his phone. A personal revelation about the unreliability of his source material. What kind of revelation? Well, that depends on you. Chen stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, gun oil, maybe, or whatever chemical they use to clean blood off things. Option 1, you call Mr. Bradley tonight, explain that you fabricated everything because you were angry about your inheritance, and convince him to kill the story. In exchange, your family's business arrangements continue unchanged, and you receive a generous consulting fee for your discretion. How generous? $200,000, Karuchi said without hesitation. Enough to finish graduate school and start your adult life without financial stress. Derek made another strangled sound. $200,000 was more money than either of us had ever imagined having, offered as casually as a tip for good service. And option 2? I asked, though I was starting to dread the answer. Option 2, Chen said quietly, is that Mr. Bradley receives evidence that you've been stalking him. Photographing his home, following his daily routines, making threatening phone calls. Evidence that will be very convincing to police because it will be very real. You'll frame me for stalking him. We'll document your stalking him, Karuchi corrected. Which will begin approximately 20 minutes after you leave this garage if you choose not to make that phone call. I looked at Derek, who was staring at both men with undisguised terror, then back at the two criminals offering to pay me a fortune or destroy my life with equal indifference. I need time to think, I said. You have until midnight, Chen replied. After that, Mr. Bradley's personal safety becomes a much more pressing concern than your decision-making process. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes after Karuchi and Chen drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. Derek had fled immediately, muttering something about needing to figure things out before disappearing into the concrete maze of downtown traffic. $200,000 or Tom Bradley's life. Maybe my life too, if I'd read Chen's implications correctly. My phone rang, making me jump so hard I nearly hit my head on the roof. Unknown number, local area code. Hello. Is this the young man who's been asking questions about certain community activities? The voice was unfamiliar, older, with a slight tremor that suggested age or fear. Who is this? Someone who saw you meeting with those men in the parking garage. Someone who thinks you should know what you're really dealing with before you make any irreversible decisions. I looked around the empty garage, suddenly paranoid that this was another layer of psychological manipulation. How do you know about the meeting? Because I've been watching Karuchi's operation for 6 months, waiting for someone brave enough or stupid enough to threaten their setup. A pause. I'm not sure which category you fall into yet. What do you want? To meet. Somewhere public, somewhere safe. I have information about your grandparents' involvement that might change your perspective on tonight's ultimatum. Against every instinct screaming at me to go home, lock the door, and call Tom Bradley to recant everything, I found myself agreeing to meet at the 24-hour diner on Highway 9. The voice gave me a description: elderly man, blue baseball cap, sitting alone in the back booth, and hung up before I could ask more questions. The drive took 15 minutes, during which my phone buzzed constantly with calls from Derek, my mother, and 2 more unknown numbers that I was afraid to answer. By the time I pulled into the diner parking lot, I was convinced I was walking into either salvation or a much more sophisticated trap. The man in the back booth looked exactly as described, but what he didn't mention was the manila folder sitting beside his coffee cup, thick with documents. He waved me over with the tired gesture of someone who'd been carrying heavy secrets for too long. "Agent Bill Morrison, IRS Criminal Investigation Division," he said quietly, sliding a badge across the table. "Retired, but working on a consulting basis for this particular investigation." My stomach dropped. "Investigation? Your grandparents' operation has been under federal surveillance for 18 months. We've been building a case against the entire network, but we needed someone on the inside to provide documentation of the daily operations." He tapped the folder. "Someone like you. I'm not on the inside. I just stumbled into this because of a will. Your family. You have access. You have credibility with the local community." Morrison opened the folder, revealing surveillance photos that made Pastor Williams' amateur collection look like vacation snapshots. "More importantly, you're clean. No financial ties to the operation, no criminal history, no reason to lie about what you've witnessed." The photos showed everything: the basement casino, money exchanges, people I recognized from church carrying duffel bags that were obviously heavy with cash. But they also showed things I hadn't seen: late-night meetings in parking lots, exchanges with people who definitely weren't local church members, what looked like weapons being transferred along with money. "Human trafficking," Morrison said, following my gaze. "That's the big charge we're building toward. The gambling and money laundering are just the foundation. These people are moving girls, some of them minors, across state lines, using the church network as safe houses and transfer points." I felt physically sick. My grandparents are involved in trafficking children. Your grandparents provide financial services and safe locations. Whether they know the full scope of what they're facilitating is something we'll determine during prosecution. Why are you telling me this now? Why not just arrest everyone? Morrison's expression darkened. "Because 3 hours ago, we received intelligence that the operation is planning to disappear key evidence and relocate primary assets. Someone tipped them off that federal attention was coming." The timeline clicked into place. My meeting with Tom Bradley, Derek's panicked phone calls, tonight's confrontation with Karuchi and Chen. My attempt to expose a local gambling ring had inadvertently triggered the evacuation of a multi-state criminal enterprise. "The newspaper story," I said, "was supposed to run tomorrow as part of a coordinated takedown. Federal raids, simultaneous arrests, the whole network rolled up at once." Morrison closed the folder. "But now they're running, which means we lose everything except what we can grab in the next few hours." My phone buzzed with a text from Karuchi: "1 hour until deadline. Hope you're making the right choice." Morrison saw the message and nodded grimly. "Which brings us to why you're here. We need you to make that phone call to Tom Bradley, but not to kill the story. To accelerate it." "What do you mean?" "We need the story to run tonight. Online edition, immediate publication. Force their hand before they can finish evacuating." Morrison leaned forward. "But first, we need you to go back to your grandparents' house and document whatever they're destroying." I stared at Agent Morrison like he'd just asked me to juggle live grenades. "You want me to go back to their house? Tonight? While they're destroying evidence of federal crimes? Your family. You have a key. They won't be expecting surveillance from someone they just threatened into silence." Morrison pulled out a small device that looked like a smartphone. "This records video and audio automatically. Just walk through the house like you're there to talk, document whatever you can see. And if Karuchi's people are watching the house, then you're a concerned grandson checking on elderly relatives after a stressful day. Nothing suspicious about that." His tone suggested this was a reasonable request rather than a suicide mission. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Tom Bradley. "Strange development. Someone just called the paper claiming you're mentally unstable and fabricated everything. Any idea what that's about?" They were already working to discredit me, just like Karuchi had promised. Which meant I was probably past the point of backing down safely anyway. "If I do this," I said to Morrison, "what happens to the people threatening Tom Bradley?" "To Marcus. Federal protective custody until we can make arrests. But only if we get enough evidence tonight to justify immediate action." Morrison's eyes were steady on mine. "Right now, we have surveillance photos and financial records. We need something that directly connects your grandparents to the trafficking operation. What would that look like? Communications. Transportation schedules. Evidence of people being moved through their house." Morrison paused. "Or documentation of the money laundering that we can trace to specific criminal activities." I thought about Grandpa's meticulous record keeping, those composition notebooks filled with names and numbers. If he was documenting everything, there might be records that showed exactly where the money was coming from and where it was going. "There's a safe in their basement," I said. "Professional grade. If they're keeping records of the bigger operation, that's where they'd be." Morrison's expression sharpened. "Can you get access to it?" "I don't know the combination. But I remembered something from Christmas dinner, Grandpa joking about how Grandma could never remember passwords, so he used the same numbers for everything. Maybe. They're creatures of habit. We need you to try. But more importantly, we need you to be safe." Morrison slid a business card across the table. "If anything feels wrong, if you see people you don't recognize, if your grandparents act suspicious, leave immediately and call that number." I pocketed the recording device and the business card, trying to ignore the voice in my head screaming that this was insane. "How much time do I have?" "Karuchi gave you until midnight to call Bradley. That gives us maybe 90 minutes before they realize you're not cooperating and start implementing whatever their backup plan involves." My phone rang. Derek's name on the caller ID made my stomach clench, but I answered anyway. "Where are you?" His voice was tight with panic. "I just drove by Grandma and Grandpa's house. There are cars there I don't recognize, and people carrying boxes out the back door." Morrison was watching my face, and I saw him nod grimly when I repeated Derek's information. They're moving faster than we expected, Morrison muttered. Which means if you're going to do this, it has to be now. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. Derek, I need you to do something for me. Go to Marcus's sister's house and stay with him until you hear from me. Don't go home, don't go to your apartment, just stay put. What the hell is going on? I'll explain later. Just trust me. I hung up before he could argue, looking at Morrison one last time. If this goes wrong. It won't, he said with more confidence than I felt. Just remember, you're visiting your grandparents. Everything else is secondary. I pulled into my grandparents' driveway at 10:47 p.m., my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. Derek hadn't been exaggerating. There were 3 cars I didn't recognize parked on the street, and through the basement windows I could see movement and shadows that definitely weren't my elderly grandparents organizing their bedding slips. The recording device felt like it weighed 50 pounds in my jacket pocket. I used my key to enter through the front door, calling out like I always did. Grandma. Grandpa. It's me. Grandpa appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his face flushed and sweaty despite the cool evening. Behind him, I could hear voices, the sound of heavy objects being moved, and what sounded suspiciously like a paper shredder running at full speed. What are you doing here? His tone was sharper than I'd ever heard it, none of the usual grandfatherly warmth. I wanted to talk about what happened today. With Pastor Williams, with Derek. I kept my voice steady, playing the part of the confused grandson. I'm having second thoughts about some things. Grandpa's expression softened slightly, but his body language remained tense. This isn't a good time. We're reorganizing some things downstairs. Maybe I could help. I took a step toward the basement stairs, and Grandpa immediately moved to block my path. No. The sharpness was back, along with something that looked like fear. I mean, it's just boring paperwork. Tax documents, old church records. Nothing you'd be interested in. From the basement came a voice I recognized, Chen, speaking in rapid, clipped sentences to someone I couldn't see. Need everything transferred by midnight. No exceptions, no delays. Grandpa quickly closed the basement door behind him, but not before I heard another voice respond, what about the girl in the back room? She's been asking about. The door slam cut off the rest of the sentence, but those few words made my blood run cold. There was someone in their basement, someone being held against their will. Morrison's warnings about human trafficking suddenly became horrifyingly real. You look tired, sweetheart, Grandma appeared from the kitchen, her voice artificially bright. Why don't you sit down? I'll make you some tea. But her hands were shaking as she guided me toward the living room, and I noticed smudges of what looked like ash on her blouse. They'd been burning documents, probably in the fireplace, based on the lingering smell of smoke in the air. Actually, I was hoping to get something from my old room, I said, improvising desperately. Some books I left here for graduate school research. Of course, dear. Grandma's smile was strained. But quickly, okay? We have company tonight. Church business. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the house could hear it. My old bedroom was at the end of the hall, but more importantly, there was a heating vent in the floor that connected directly to the basement. If I could get close enough to it, the recording device might pick up whatever was happening downstairs. I knelt beside the vent, pulling out Morrison's device and holding it close to the metal grating. Voices drifted up immediately, much clearer than I'd expected. 17 years old, been here since Tuesday. Client in Atlanta is getting impatient. Move her with the others tomorrow night. Clean house completely before the federal heat gets too close. Old man's records go back 15 years. Names, dates, transport schedules. Burn everything. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the device. They weren't just talking about destroying financial records, they were talking about moving people, about a 17-year-old girl being held somewhere in my grandparents' house. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I spun around to find Chin standing in the doorway, his expression calm but his eyes deadly cold. Having trouble finding those books, he asked softly. Having trouble finding those books, he asked softly. I palmed the recording device, slipping it into my back pocket as I stood. Just looking for my old philosophy textbooks. Graduate research, you know. Chin stepped into the room, his movements predatory and deliberate. Funny thing about graduate research, it requires a very particular kind of curiosity. The kind that sometimes leads people to places they shouldn't be. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you do. He pulled out his phone, showing me a photo taken through the diner window, me sitting across from Agent Morrison. Federal agents make interesting dinner companions. My mouth went dry, but I forced myself to stay calm. I don't know who that man was. He said he knew my family, wanted to offer condolences about my grandparents' situation. Bill Morrison, IRS Criminal Investigation. 23 years tracking financial crimes. Chen's smile was razor thin. Your grandfather's basement isn't the only thing we monitor. The sound of sirens suddenly filled the night air, growing louder by the second. Chen's expression shifted from predatory confidence to something approaching panic as red and blue lights began flashing through the bedroom windows. Federal agents. The voice from downstairs was amplified by bullhorns. This is a raid. Everyone exit the building with your hands visible. Chen grabbed my arm, his grip painful. What did you do? Nothing. I swear, I just came to talk to them. The basement door slammed open below us, followed by heavy footsteps and shouted commands. Clear the stairs. Move, move, move. Chen was dragging me toward the window when my phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. Story went live 20 minutes ago. Federal coordination activated. Stay down and stay safe. Tom Bradley hadn't killed the story, he'd published it early, online, just like Morrison had planned. Everything was falling into place exactly as the federal agents had hoped, and Chen was realizing his entire operation was collapsing in real time. Downstairs. Now. An agent appeared in the bedroom doorway, weapon drawn. Chen immediately released me, raising his hands. I'm cooperating, he said calmly. This young man was just visiting his grandparents. We know exactly who this young man is, the agent replied. Are you injured? The question was directed at me. No, I'm fine. But there's a girl in the basement. 17 years old, they said she was being. We've got her. She's safe now. The agent gestured toward the stairs. Agent Morrison is waiting for you downstairs. The next hour passed in a blur of federal agents, evidence collection, and questions. My grandparents were led away in handcuffs, Grandpa's face a mask of bitter resignation while Grandma sobbed about not understanding how things had gotten so complicated. Chen and Karuchi were processed with the cold efficiency of people who'd been through this before. Derek arrived just as the last police car was leaving, his face pale with shock as he took in the scene. Jesus Christ, what happened here? The truth, I said simply. Finally. Agent Morrison found me sitting on the front steps, the recording device safely returned to his custody along with detailed statements about everything I'd witnessed. The girl you heard them talking about, her name is Sophia. She's been missing from Miami for 3 weeks. Her family's going to get her back because you were brave enough to do the right thing. 6 months later, the final pieces of the federal case were falling into place. Karuchi and Chen had pled guilty to avoid trafficking charges, agreeing to testify against the larger network. My grandparents, facing the reality of their situation, had accepted plea agreements that would keep them in federal prison for the next 8 years. The inheritance Derek thought he was getting had been seized as proceeds of criminal activity, but honestly, neither of us wanted that blood money anyway. We'd both found jobs, different paths that didn't depend on our family's criminal legacy. Marcus and I were planning our wedding for the following spring, something that would have been impossible when my grandparents' conditional love hung over our relationship like a sword. Pastor Williams had been defrocked and was serving his own prison sentence, but we'd found a new church, one where our love was celebrated rather than condemned. Tom Bradley's story had won 2 journalism awards, and Sophia had testified before Congress about human trafficking, helping to strengthen federal laws protecting victims. The network of fake religious institutions had been completely dismantled, and the legitimate churches that had been unknowingly infiltrated were working to rebuild their community's trust. Sometimes I wondered if I'd made the right choice, whether the destruction had been worth the truth. Then I'd think about Sophia, about the other victims who'd been rescued, about the families that had been reunited, and the question answered itself. My grandparents had taught me that love came with conditions, that family meant accepting corruption for the sake of appearances, that money mattered more than morality. They were wrong about all of it. The real family I'd built, Marcus, Derek in his own complicated way, even Agent Morrison who still checked in occasionally, was based on truth, not transactions. It was messy and difficult and sometimes painful, but it was real. And that made all the difference.